So let's ask the question this morning, again in answering the error, will there be a tribulation? So that's kind of what accompanies when we talk about the rapture, is what we've talked about the last couple of Sundays. Make sure all this is working. With the technical difficulty we had this morning, it wouldn't surprise me. But nonetheless, many people will teach, again, they have the rapture and then the tribulation. And again, there's a lot of confusion on if it's the rapture is before the tribulation, during, the midway, or after. So let's kind of look. Let me teach you about the tribulation, what a lot of people teach, and then we will begin to refute it. So you've probably heard, again, this was quite an interesting study, a future time period where God accomplishes two aspects of his plan: to complete discipline on Israel. So they're going to go back to Daniel chapter 9 and verse 24. He's going to judge the unbelieving godless there during Revelation 6 through 18. And we talked about that a little bit again. Some of the people who teach this, you have the churches in Revelation 1 through 3. They're in the throne room 4 and 5. Talking about the rapture and then this tribulation coming. So that's a lot of where they get this. And they use Daniel 9, 24 through 27 during Daniel's 70 weeks, which we'll talk about at a later time, to say that the tribulation will last 7 years. So that's the idea that we're getting at behind that. I'll give you just a little bit to get some of the verses down for that. But that's really this is the core biblical text we talked about in class. This is where they're going to go. If you're going to ask someone about the tribulation, which is a very scary thing if you hear anything about it, the way they discuss it anyway. But again, many people want the pre-tribulation because they don't want to have to go through the tribulation. They don't want the church to have to be here through it, though when you begin to read some of this stuff, you kind of seem a little bit more like the church will go through the tribulation, but we all go through tribulation, right? That's what we got to take from this, is that everybody, and we're going to look at the tribulation that really came upon them here in just a moment. All right, so you may have heard it called the tribulation, or you may get referred to as the Great Tribulation. Now, the Great Tribulation is the last half. Remember, 3.5 years. We're 3.5 years in. The Antichrist, let me make sure I got all my facts right. The Antichrist comes, and then 3.5 years of good times, and then he switches his position, and he turns evil, and then it becomes the Great Tribulation, the 3.5 years of Great Tribulation, with the wrath of God increasing. So, again, depending on who you talk to or who you listen to, some look at it as the church goes through some of the good times, and then right before the Great Tribulation, we're raised up, so that puts it in a mid-trib viewpoint, if that's what you want to hold. And this is kind of what Matthew is teaching. So here's kind of the layout of it. What they get from is Matthew 24, 21. Again, don't worry about that outline so much. We'll get to it here maybe with the close of the time that we have left. But Matthew 24, 21, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world, to this time no, nor ever shall be. So they look at this and say, all right, there's going to be this great tribulation. They go back in verse 15, when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then we find that that's his thing. So that's the teaching is, again, even though he's called the abomination of desolation, in Daniel, they want to put in there Antichrist. He's not referred to as the Antichrist, but that's what they put in. So the Antichrist is here. It's a good time, 3.5 years of peace. And then the Antichrist is revealed to be the Antichrist, and we have 3.5 years of tribulation. Then they go to Matthew 29. Notice, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall not fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So there's the second coming, right? So again, when you read that, it's like, okay, maybe that is what it is. The Antichrist is going to arise. There's going to be tribulation. And then notice immediately after the tribulation, Christ returns. So that finishes the tribulation, which ushers in, right, the millennial reign. That's what they're going to teach. I'm going to teach you what Matthew 24 is really about here in just a minute. So if you're, again, we were talking about that in class. If you're reading that and you say, man, that sounds right, Ben, that sounds pretty close. Well, let's get into some context, and then we'll kind of refute that. Everybody got those verses? Again, that's what we're going to teach. Again, there's tribulation, then there's the great tribulation. So we gotta be mindful of that. So in the context of premillennialism, what we're getting at again, notice that Jesus has raptured the saved. That's what they teach. 1 Thessalonians 4:13 and 18, or 13 through 18. 1 Corinthians 15, 53, 52, and following. We're saved, right? The church is saved. That's what they want to teach. So then this begins the tribulation. Now that's across the board pretty accurate. They will use 1 Thessalonians 5:9 to teach that we don't go through the tribulation. So 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 9, let not a widow be taken into the number. That's 1 Timothy. That's a good one, but not the one I need. 1 Thessalonians, talking about a widow if she has children, to take care of them. Verse 9, for God hath not appointed us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. That's the verse they'll use. Really kind of out of context, not really looking at that idea. But yes, as a Christian, I don't have to worry about facing those tribulations because Jesus is my Savior. But the begins of the tribulation, we don't suffer the wrath. They will go to Matthew 24, 29, 31. No, that's supposed to be, that's supposed to be, there's Matthew 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days. I was thinking I had on there 40, that should have been 40 and 41. Then shall two be in the field, and the one shall be taken, and the other left. Two women shall be grinding at the mill, the one shall be taken, and the other left. That may need to be Matthew 24, 40 through 41, though it does talk about the tribulation there in 29 through 31. But nonetheless, we're taken. So that's the context of premillennialism. That's what they're wanting to teach. But what we find, and that's what I was talking about in class, is that there is no verse that tells me when this tribulation will occur. Just we hear about this tribulation. So that's interesting to me. Again, as a simple-minded person, when I begin to look at that, I think, all right, if there is going to be a tribulation, surely the text should tell me either pre-trib or mid-trib, or am I going to have to go through the tribulation? But what we find is this disconnect. But again, across the board, if you begin to listen to these people, a lot of them will say the rapture happens and then the 7 years of tribulation. Has anybody kind of heard that teaching? Is that what everybody's familiar with? I see a few heads shaking out there. That's typically what you'll hear. But what we find is I don't read about the rapture happening and then the tribulation happening. So that's difficult for me to go through that, because I would think that if we were needing to prepare for this tribulation in some way, or it was going to be talking about that really we should have a little bit more about that. Does anybody have any questions there or comments towards that? About the tribulation, again, there's no scripture that tells you when this event is supposed to take place. And that's important because what we're going to find is it's already taken place. But no future event, right? And that's bothersome to me, because if I'm going to preach that there's a tribulation coming, I want to kind of know, when this is supposed to occur in a sense. If I'm supposed to, if all these events are kind of lining up with it, raptures, 1,000-year reigns, all these things, I would kind of need to know. I would think that the scripture would kind of tell us a little bit more about it. So let me open it up before we get into Matthew 24. Any questions maybe on that? Or different things maybe you have heard? All right, so again, kind of keep in mind what we're going to do now is we're fixing to take apart Matthew 24. But people will get you scared. And I know Brittany and I were talking about that the other day. It is, right? It's kind of a scary thought to be in a tribulation that has never been like the world has seen before, right? For a Christian. But again, the Christians have been raptured, but maybe you're staying here on earth and it's going to be hard times and you don't want to be here in the tribulation. But maybe we get taken up right before it gets really bad. See, it's very confusing to that. But when you read about this stuff, it really is terrifying in a sense to think about what is going to take place in the tribulation. And people really get concerned, right? And then you kind of miss, you think about, all right, the saved are going to be raptured, then tribulation. But we don't really have any connection to this. That's what we want to look at. Any thoughts, any comments there on the tribulation? I will answer Miss Misty's question. A couple of weeks ago, she asked about when this teaching kind of started. And I thought about that this morning when I was kind of getting ready. When did, right, this kind of take place? Because what's interesting is we're going to read in 24, a lot of the early writers, saw this fulfillment. But John Nelson Darby, it's going to be around the 1830s, Miss Misty, is when this is going to really start beginning to take shape. John Nelson Darby, around the 1830s. So what he's going to do, he's kind of going to start it, and it's going to become popularized. C.I. Scofield. You'll see a few of those Bibles alone. If you've ever seen a Scofield reference Bible, I always think about Scofield because I think of the pistol Scofield, but those Scofield Bibles in the notes will have a lot of this material. If you want to study up on it, I would encourage you to try to find one of those Scofield Bibles. But the Dallas Theological Seminary, they also kind of took this and ran. I don't know how many may be familiar with Hal Lindsey. I don't know. Have you ever read any of his stuff? Hal Lindsey? Okay, yeah. The late great Planet Earth is his. Yeah. I know what you're gonna say. He gets out there.
But one thing I can't get out of anything I'm reading, and maybe you said it just went right over my head. Exactly, the people that teach this. What do they say? How do they define the word tribulation?
Right. Yeah, you won't.
It has a big bearing on it. I mean, the way the Bible teaches is just a trial.
Yeah.
Temptation that we overcome. But that doesn't seem like that's what what do they say?
They will teach. They will teach really, I don't know if it's defined because again, when you look at this tribulation, even in Matthew 24. What we read about is it's just going to be, like I said, a great tribulation. They don't really say what's going to happen. They just imagine all of this evil, wicked, just evil being rampant on the earth, kind of. There's no proof text to any of the rest, and that's a great point. Again, using the logical side of your brain. Okay, but again, the rest of the New Testament teaches me I'm going to suffer persecution and tribulation as a Christian. So what's that different than anything else? And kind of what you're talking about, the church in America, if you listen to a lot of American people reading and teaching this stuff, is they don't want to be persecuted. But, there's Christians dying by Muslim hands all over the world today. But that's different, right? The church in America, right? So many times we look at America as this God's nation that we're just not going to be able to go through the tribulation, but that's not the case. I think the beheading, all right, when you go back to Revelation 19, I think it is, beheaded for that case, they're going to reign. They're going through the tribulation. I think that's part of it. If you're a Christian, put to death, things like that. I think that's Revelation 19 or 20. 20, Revelation 20, verse 4, and I saw thrones, and they sat upon them. Judgment was given unto them, and I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus, for the word of God, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their foreheads and in their hands, for they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. I was thinking they had came through the tribulation, though. I guess that's what's going on, is the mark of the beast and worshiping the image. and all that was during the tribulation. I thought it was a little better than that. But I guess if you're beheaded, but we know that the first century Christians, the apostles were beheaded. That was a common occurrence in that time. But yeah, good point. I need to do a little studying into that, see. But they'll just conjure up, like I said, just about anything to talk about just the wickedness that's going to happen in the tribulation. Yet we don't have any scripture that base that with. But we are, again, when we get into Matthew 24 here, there was coming some tribulations that he's talking about in 24, and they're pretty graphic. And we're going to talk about it. All right, anybody else? Good question, or good comment there, Miss Linda. Anybody else? Oh, just kind of finishing up on John Nelson Darby, I had wrote in here. Again, Hal Lindsey, if you read Hal Lindsey, he's way out there, like Pluto. The Tim, I can't read my writing. Well, y'all probably seen that Left Behind series. Has anybody ever seen it? There was a movie. Yeah, I never watched it, but I've seen Left Behind. All right, if you see the Left Behind, that's what it's talking about. It's raptured, and we're here on earth going through the tribulation. That's what the Left Behind is about. But what Darby brought, again, and what kind of flourished, and this is going to kind of, the dispensational premillennialism, but really what the sharp distinction between Israel and the church, and that's what we're getting into when you get into this premillennial stuff, is not spiritual Israel as the church, but Israel as a nation and the church being separated. He really put that. Darby taught a pre-tribulation rapture. His gap theory, that's another good one. The 70 weeks of Daniel, he puts this big extension between week 69 and week 70, which is strange, but that's what he teaches. And then he kind of teaches this two-phase second coming, the idea that he comes for the rapture, then he comes back on earth. So that's Darby. Do some research on him if you'd like, because it's kind of some interesting material that he lends to. Okay, now let's get into Matthew 24. So I really want to get into some of this. So when they're looking at Matthew 24, again, what they're looking at is we're looking for the abomination of desolation. We're looking for the tribulation to come, none that has ever been before, right? No. Again, I guess that's kind of what they're saying is, yeah, Christians have been beheaded and burnt alive and different things like that, but not this kind of tribulation is not like anything like that, I guess, Miss Linda, is what they're getting from this. But nonetheless, and then we kind of talk about immediately after the tribulation, Jesus coming and things like that. So, Matthew 24, we need to be able to dissect this chapter. So it's all taken out of context. Matthew 24, there's going to be a tribulation coming, but we have to go back. If you have your Bibles, I would encourage you to write down in your notes here, Matthew 23, 37 through 39. Again, when something happens to me, context. We've got to remember it. Don't think the chapter break changes it exactly. What we find in verse 37 of Matthew 23, notice what Jesus is saying and who he's speaking to. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, thou that killest the prophets and stonest them which are sent unto thee, how often would I have gathered thy children together, even as a hen gathereth her chickens under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. For I say unto you, ye shall not see me henceforth, till ye shall come. Blessed is he that cometh in the name of the Lord. That's very important. He is talking about Jerusalem. Again, now this is right before he's going to have his Olivet Discourse, and then we're going to get very close to the crucifixion account given to us in the gospel. But the Jews, they always persecuted the prophets, right? All the way back. When they would come and preach these messages of destruction, they hated the prophets. They hated someone to tell them that they were doing wrong. And Jesus, he says, Jerusalem, I would have gathered you, right? He wanted to help them. But 38 is vital. Behold, your house is left unto you desolate. Now, what's the house in Jerusalem at this time? What would the house be? The temple. Very good. Yeah, the temple. The temple, your house. What were the Jews' house, right? Not their personal houses, the house of God, right? The temple. It's going to be left to you desolate. Notice in verse 24 as we begin looking at this, and Jesus... and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. So he's come out of the temple, right? Your house is left to you desolate. And the Galileans, they're like me, right? They've never seen any big buildings, and they're looking at the temple, and they're looking at all this stuff. Notice what he says. See ye not, verse 2, of all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. The temple. There's not going to be a stone left upon another. Now as they retreat, and remember, out of Jerusalem, across the Kidron Valley, over onto the Mount of Olives, you can still see the city, and he sat upon the Mount of Olives. So you're in distance of this great city, Jerusalem. Notice there in verse 3, and the disciples came and to him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be? That's question number 1. When shall these things be? Number 2, and what shall be the sign of thy coming? And some look at a third question, but tied into 2, and the end of the world. So these Galilean fishermen, right, they see this great temple of God. And here's Jesus, and he says, there's not going to be a stone left on another upon this temple. So they think, well, if the temple's destroyed, the world has to come to an end. So he says, tell us when these things. What's these things? What things? Bingo. That's right. Yes, the temple, if he says, if they ask, tell us when shall these things be? It's no stone left upon another, right? That's exactly what Jesus is answering. What he's going to teach in 24 is talking about the coming destruction of Jerusalem. And then we find the second question, as the Galileans, his disciples, they said, well, obviously if the temple's destroyed, when's the world going to come to an end? And where's the sign of thy coming and the end of the world? So there's 2 questions, and they're both answered in here in 24. So what we find then, and again, you can go to your outline of 24. When you're looking at that, have that, I think, in verse 3. Again, here's both the questions. So he then begins to describe the destruction of Jerusalem. So he warns us, you shall hear of wars, or you'll hear of false Christs coming. You'll hear of wars and rumors of wars. Nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, all these things, famines, pestilence, earthquakes, divers places. All that's going to take place, right? You don't need to be concerned about those things. But what's going to happen is, in verse 15, they are going to see this abomination of desolation. Now, when they saw the abomination of desolation, now again, notice that, whoso readeth, let him understand. The Jews knew, right? The Christians knew what he was talking about. They understood. When they read this, they understood it. So we need to make sure they knew what was happening at this time. They're to leave the city. Notice, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of the house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no nor ever shall be. And again, except those days be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened. So what we find is that when they see this abomination of desolation get out of Jerusalem, not that the Antichrist is here, not that, again, if we're going to take this literally, like the way they interpret this, if we see the Antichrist, then we are to flee to the mountains, if we're going to follow it. But the people in Jerusalem, in that area, in Judea, knew to get out of town when they saw the abomination of desolation. Again, they read it, they understood, they leave. Now, here's where we get into the history. Love that stuff, if you can't tell. Vespasian, he's the Roman emperor, or he's the Roman general at this time. Nero is emperor. Vespasian is the general, and he is going to besiege Jerusalem. Now, I've got up here wars 409, 486, 498. If you have a copy of Josephus, or you want to get one, I think there's a copy in the library. But that's where I'm getting that from. You read Josephus, he's going to talk about, again, the Jewish wars. He's going to talk about them coming and gathering around the city there at that time. So that's important. So it's book 4, Wars, book 4, chapter 9. If I can find it. I've got all these tabs. All right, so he records again now. Josephus was a Jewish historian. No affiliation with the Church of Christ, no affiliation with Christians. In fact, he says, and now Vespasian had fortified all the places around Jerusalem and erected citadels at Jericho, Abida, and placed garrisons in them, both partly out of his own Romans and partly out of the body of his reinforcements. Notice, though, he returns to Rome after the death of Nero. Now, the Roman general, can't carry out any of these orders until you get a new man in power. So Nero dies, and Vespasian leaves. And we find that in section 491. Now, as Vespasian returned to Caesarea and was getting ready with all his army to march directly to Jerusalem, he was informed that Nero was dead after he had reigned 13 years and 8 days. So, section 497, Vespasian put off at first his expedition against Jerusalem and stood waiting while the emperor was transferred after the death of Nero. Moreover, when he had heard that Galba was made emperor, he attempted nothing until he also should send him some directions about the war. So he can't make a move until the new emperor tells him. However, he sent his son Titus to him to salute him and to receive his commands about the Jews. So what's happening here in Josephus' recording is that Vespasian is marching to Jerusalem. He is about to besiege the city, and that's what they did. I know we're kind of running, but bear with me on this because this is really important. He returns to Rome after the death of Nero. Vespasian is eventually going to be made emperor, and his son Titus is going to be the one that finally ends up going in and destroying Jerusalem. So, in the context of that, if I'm a Christian around that area and I've heard Jesus say the abomination of desolation, right? The Jews, right, or the Romans, they were abomination. They were going to be desolating the area, that idea. So when I see this Roman general coming and bringing this army about Jerusalem, I am to flee. All right? That makes sense, right? Is everybody kind of, so there's a time frame, there's a lull in the siege that the people that knew to get out of Jerusalem got out of Jerusalem. Now, when we look at what Josephus records for us, let me move my Bible here. Remember where those things are at. I thought I had them all wrote. Maybe they're in your notes in your handout there. Let me see. Well, I guess not. All right, well, I'll just read you Eusebius there. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time pronouncing his name. But anyway, so we have the Jewish historians writing these things, and they're saying, look, there's a lull in that, but Eusebius records, all right, let me find where we find that okay, now this is where they're going to do a historian about the church, the early church, and that's what's kind of good to read him. Listen to what he says. Members of the Jerusalem church were ordered by an oracle given by revelation to those worthy of it to leave the city and settle in a city of Perea called Pella. Here they migrated from Jerusalem as if once holy men had deserted the royal capital of the Jews and the whole land of Judea, the judgment of God might finally fall on them for their crimes against Christ and his apostles, utterly blotting out all that wicked generation. So he records that the Christians left Jerusalem. And that's exactly what we find in Matthew 24, is that when they hear of these things, they are to leave. Now, like 23 through 28, you're going to hear of Christ coming, but don't be alarmed, right? Verse 27, for as lightning cometh out of the east, shineth even to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So you're not going to miss the second coming of Christ. So then in 29, 30, and 31, we see this apocryphal language, and I've got in your handout, when it talks about the sun being darkened and the moon not giving her light, I've got references to other nations, Babylon, Egypt, Edom, the northern kingdom, the southern kingdom, same kind of language, right? Not literal, not that the moon's literally going to be turned to literal blood, but that's a downfall. Now, if there's a nation that's about to collapse, What nation is that? Israel. That's right, the Jews. The Jewish nation, as they knew it, was about to collapse. Then, verse 30, they're going to realize the Son of Man. They're going to realize who Jesus was. His glory is going to be evident because the Jews did not believe that God would destroy his home. His house, right? The temple of God is not going to be destroyed, but buddy, it does. In fact, as Josephus records, as they burn the temple, the gold melts down into the cracks, and they bust the rocks out to get the gold within the cracks, so no stone is left on another, fulfilling the prophecy of Jesus. So again, we look through that in verse 35. 34 is important. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. So if this first answer, if Jesus is preaching, around 30 to 33 AD, depending on, your time frame there, could a generation be there in 70 AD? Right? That's only 40 years removed. Absolutely. That generation would see this. So if this is prophetic for a future tribulation, then how can a generation not pass till all these things be fulfilled? Right? If this is really the actual second coming of Christ here in 29, 30, and 31, well, why are we here, right? What are these things happening? Then verse 36 of Matthew 24 is, and notice, I've got it underlined or highlighted in my Bible, but of that day. Now, what is that day? The second question, the coming of the Son of Man. But of that day, notice in verse 22, except those days should be shortened. Verse 29, the tribulation of those days, the destruction of Jerusalem. Then we see Jesus say, but of that day and hour no man knoweth. No, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. So, again, 37, 38, just like in the days of Noah, life's going to be going on. They didn't know it until the flood came. Verse 39, 40 and 41 do not teach of a rapture, but the sense, notice, again, in first that rapture kind of illustrate or verse, then shall two be in the field and one shall be taken, right? The saved, 1 Thessalonians 4, 16, 17, were caught, the one taken, and the other left. Now the left wasn't left here on earth, but the left in the sense of this religious or righteous abandonment, right? When you go into Matthew 25, they're separated, the left and the right. Right? We go off into punishment. That's what's going to happen, right? It's going to be just like the days of Noah. Life's going to be going on like normal. And what we find is that some are going to be taken, the Christians, and the other, they're going to be left, right? They're left by who? Who left them at that time, at the judgment? Jesus, God, right? Jesus and God, the Christians, they go into heaven. Those that are left, the world, the wicked, go off into the lake of fire, the second death. There we read about it in Matthew 25. So Matthew 24, 42 through 51, all he's teaching is be ready, be ready, be ready, be ready, be ready. I don't have to worry about this tribulation. In fact, we got just a minute or two left. Read these things for yourselves. It is recorded, he's using some of Josephus's notes, that the number of people in Jerusalem were 3 million. That there was it seemed like they said there was a feast around this time. There was 3 million people in Jerusalem. There's just horrible atrocities that happen. It does talk about how that they don't have any bread, they don't have anything to eat. In fact, again, all right, some of the people in Jerusalem tried to get out, and this is in Josephus, but we don't have the time for me to look them up exactly. But it's in there. They tried to escape. 500 escape at one time. They crucify them. Josephus records, he's there watching this. He says that they ran out of trees to hang the people on. There were so many people coming out of Jerusalem trying to escape. Now, the Roman army circles the city. Nothing's coming in or coming out. So it only takes a matter of time before you eat all the food that's in there. Famine occurs. There's a great bit of famine that's happening that's driving these people crazy. The zealots that are in there, they're killing each other because some people want to surrender, some people want to fight. They're all going in one with another. So they try to escape. They catch them. They crucify them. right outside the gates there, outside of the walls, so they're not going to try to escape now. I will read you this. Well, some try to leave. They've swallowed their gold, their riches. They find out about it, and you guess what happens? Them Roman soldiers, they don't care. Start disemboweling people. It doesn't matter if you've got gold in your stomach or not. They catch you coming out wanting to surrender, they cut you open. Right? Now, that's pretty horrible. Right? Now, we're talking about tribulation. If I'm going to try to surrender and they're going to disembowel me alive, right? They're just going to cut my stomach open to try to see if I've got any gold in there. Pretty bad times. Let me read this recording that Josephus says, and then we'll finish, about a woman here. Let me get to... Notice he says, I would gladly have omitted this tragedy lest prosperity suspect me of having fabricated it. This is Josephus talking. But countless witnesses of my own generation support me. There was a woman named Mary, the daughter of Eleazar, who lived beyond Jordan in the village of Bethsazer. She was well known for family and wealth and had fled to Jerusalem with the rest of the population. So everybody, that may be what it was, everybody, as they're marching in, they're coming to the safety of the walls of Jerusalem, where she was trapped in the siege. The partisan chiefs seized most of the possessions she had brought from Perea, and their bodyguards plundered the rest of her property and food through daily raids. In fury, she cursed the looters, but when none of them killed her, either in anger or pity, she yielded to rage and hunger. Defying nature, she took her own baby boy, whom she was suckling, and said, Poor little mite, why do I keep you alive in war, famine, and rebellion? If we live, we're Roman slaves, but hunger will overtake slavery, and the partisans are worse than both. Come, be my food, an avenging fury to the rebels, and the one story of Jewish suffering that the world must still hear. With these words, she killed her son, then roasted him and ate half, hiding the rest. At that moment, the partisans arrived, smelling the unholy aroma, threatened her with instant death if they were not given what she had prepared. She replied that she had saved a fine helping for them and uncovered the remains of her child. Overcome with horror, they were stupefied at the sight. But she said, This child was my own, and the deed is mine too. Eat as I have also eaten. Don't be more squeamish than a woman or more tender-hearted than a mother. But if you're queasy and disapprove of my sacrifice, then since I have eaten half, ye may as well leave me the rest. Then they went away trembling, cowards of the first time who scarcely gave up even this food. But horror immediately filled the entire city, everyone seeing the tragedy before his own eyes and shuddering as if the crimes were his own. The starving sought death and envied those who had realized it before seeing or hearing these outrageous atrocities. That's just one excerpt of that book. A woman eats her own child, saving half of it for later. So, yeah, pretty, and again, that's just one part of it. They were hungry, they were wanting to die. The Romans, by the time they actually got into Jerusalem, they were so mad at the Jews, they killed everybody. Talks about the blood running, down in the streets. They wanted to kill them all. And then what we find is eventually they end up destroying the temple, burning it, things like that. So Titus goes in. I wish Tyler and Scarlett were still here. When you look at the Ark of Titus, if you do some research on that, you will see them carrying stuff out of the temple. So he destroys the temple. So in short, as we close, Matthew 24, the beginning 35 verses there is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. This tribulation was to the Jews in Jerusalem. That's what they were talking about. That's what Jesus is saying. And there ain't been nothing like that since. So what we find then, 36 and following, or from 36 to 41, Jesus says, I don't know when I'm coming back, right? Nobody knows but God, and be ready after that. Any questions, comments concerning some of that? Some pretty harsh stuff. I would encourage you, get a copy of Josephus. That's like open domain. You can get online, just type in, Josephus's writing PDF. He's got a lot of stuff in there about that. The other historians. I was trying to think if I had one more here. Any questions or comments there as we're closing? I kind of hated to kind of talk about some of that stuff, but it's important that we realize what was going on there with them. Okay? That's what we need to realize. Those in our young adult class, historical context, if I'm reminded, if I know a little bit about the destruction of AD 70, and I read Matthew 24, that becomes much more clear. All right. I apologize. It was a little lengthy lesson, but there's a lot to cover. Don't be alarmed about a tribulation. We'll talk about later on, I think maybe the Antichrist is next, so we'll kind of look at him next, but, don't get too alarmed about some of this stuff, But anyway, hopefully that'll help you in your thoughts, and maybe that'll help you to help others along the way.